For more than a century, history, archaeology, ethnology, and anthropology have been driven by a shared curiosity. Where did human groups come from? How did they relate to one another? And where did communities live before they appeared in the written record of the lands they later called home? Behind many modern theories about languages and peoples lies an older habit of thought, one that did not begin in laboratories or excavation sites, but in sacred stories. In the Western world especially, explanations for the spread of different languages and cultures were shaped early by religious narratives, and one story in particular left a deep imprint. It tells of a time when humanity spoke with one voice, settled together on a plain, and attempted to build a city crowned by a tower reaching toward the sky. The story continues with a divine intervention that disrupts mutual understanding, fractures a single language into many, and scatters people across the earth. Whether read as theology, metaphor, or legend, this tale offered an attractive template. One origin, one center, then dispersion, confusion, and distance. That template became even more influential when scholars began to hunt for what later came to be called the homeland problem, the question of where a language family or a people began before spreading outward. It is easy to see why such a model became persuasive. Many communities seem to share deep similarities despite living far apart, and it feels intuitive to imagine an earlier period when they were closer together, shaped by a shared cultural world. If Turkic-speaking groups once lived farther east, if Semitic-speaking groups are often associated with southern deserts, if many African populations are linked to African homelands and indigenous peoples to the Americas, then it can seem natural to assume that Indo-European speaking groups also once clustered in a limited region before expanding. In this imagination, the most distant branches of a language family are explained by early separation. Those who left first carried fewer shared innovations, and those who remained longer developed more common traits. Over time, migrants met other communities, intermarried, adopted customs, and absorbed local words. The result, according to this way of thinking, was the formation of mixed populations, mixed cultures, and even mixed languages. The idea of linguistic mixing became especially prominent in the early 20th century, when certain scholars argued that languages do not simply disappear under migration and conquest, but blend into each other. In this view, invasion does not erase speech, it fuses speech. Ethnic identities, meanwhile, are treated as unstable, temporary labels, rather than permanent biological realities. Such thinking did not remain purely academic. It could be pulled into the ideological gravity of large, multi-ethnic empires, where official narratives often preferred fluid identity over claims of distinct origin. In these settings, theories about cultural and linguistic blending could serve a political purpose, whether intentionally or not, by supporting broader messages about unity, integration, and the diminishing importance of separate ethnic histories. Few ancient peoples became more entangled in these debates than the Hittites. They are often presented as a striking example of complexity. A state that emerges in Anatolia, written in an Indo-European language, surrounded by older local traditions, and interacting constantly with neighbouring cultures. This makes them a tempting case study for anyone who wants to argue that languages and identities are rarely pure. Some interpretations describe the Hittites as early movers who left a supposed homeland long before later Indo-European expansions, arriving in Anatolia and gradually blending with local populations. Under this picture, their language survives, but their society becomes deeply shaped by the region, absorbing local elements until it looks unlike the imagined original. Even physical anthropology, based on skull measurements, once used to classify populations, has been invoked to argue that Anatolia shows mixing across many periods. Today, such methods are approached far more cautiously, but historically they were frequently used to support sweeping claims. Long before these 20th century disputes, however, European observers were already noticing something that demanded explanation: the resemblance between widely separated languages. Even travellers with limited formal training could spot familiar echoes. The recognition of systematic language relationships slowly moved from casual observation into scholarly method. Early attempts often relied on single words and loose comparisons, especially religious terms. Then more careful work began to focus not just on similar meanings, but on patterned sound changes. The shift mattered because it offered a way to argue that similarities were not coincidence or borrowing, but evidence of deep historical connection. As the study of language comparison developed, scholars proposed that many European and some Asian languages must descend from a common ancestor tongue. This ancestor was not directly recorded, but reconstructed by comparing related languages and reasoning backward. Over time, this reconstruction project grew more ambitious. It sought to rebuild ancient word forms, infer sound systems, and even sketch what the vocabulary of a vanished language might have looked like. Yet the same method carried a danger. Reconstruction depends on assumptions, and once the number of reconstructed forms grows large, the temptation to treat hypothesis as certainty grows with it. If rules are stretched too far or applied too creatively, the method can produce elegant-looking results that rest on weak foundations. In the most extreme cases, speculative reconstructions can multiply until an entire, imagined language seems to exist more vividly in the scholar's mind than in the evidence itself. This is where the homeland debate becomes especially vulnerable. Once a reconstructed vocabulary is treated as real, it becomes possible to argue that the original speakers lived in a specific environment. If the shared vocabulary includes words for certain animals, plants, tools, vehicles, or farming practices, then the homeland is placed where those things seem plausible. If the reconstructed world appears mountainous rather than flat, the homeland shifts toward highlands. If wheeled vehicles or wine appear in the reconstructed set, the homeland is placed at a stage where those innovations would fit. But each step relies on a chain of interpretation. The further the chain stretches, the more room appears for confident claims built on uncertain ground. That uncertainty is exactly why the search for an Indo-European homeland became one of the most contested and, at times, most abused debates in modern historical thought. The core problem is simple. Ancient peoples rarely left records saying, in plain language, our ancestors migrated from this place to that place at this date. Greek and Roman writers do not present themselves as migrants from the far north. Many groups who later became famous in history describe themselves as native to the lands where they appear. The Hittites are especially silent in this respect. Written sources from their world do not openly narrate a migration into Anatolia, and the material record does not present an obvious trail that can be followed like footprints in snow. This silence creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite stories. When evidence is thin, imagination grows powerful. Once the homeland idea gained prestige, it also gained political value. From the late 19th century onward, the question of origin often became a competition. If a prestigious language family is assumed to have started somewhere, then claiming that somewhere becomes a way of claiming deep historical importance. In parts of Europe, scholars argued fiercely over which region should be considered the cradle. Some focused heavily on Central Europe, while other regions were pushed to the margins of attention. In certain nationalist climates, the homeland debate was pulled into narratives of superiority. Archaeology, language, and identity were braided together into ideological arguments. A pottery style could be declared the product of an imagined ancestral people, with little supporting proof. From there, the imagined ancestors could be used to justify modern political attitudes. Predictably, rival political environments produced rival homeland theories. When one extreme tried to place the origin in a region associated with its own national prestige, others reacted by relocating the homeland elsewhere. In that back and forth, proposals moved across the map. Northern plains, southern steppes, highlands near mountain chains, and even more distant territories. Some theories gained popularity not because they were strongly proven, but because they served as counterweights to other theories perceived as dangerous. Scholarship, ideology, and historical trauma sometimes blended in ways that were difficult to separate. In the 20th century, one of the most influential alternatives placed the homeland in the steppe zones north of the Black Sea, associating early Indo-European expansion with pastoral life, horse breeding, and burial mounds. This steppe model was powerful because it seemed to match certain archaeological patterns and offered an expansive stage for migration. Yet it too could be politicized, especially in climates where ancient steppe populations were claimed as ancestral to modern nations. Competing interpretations followed, including models that pushed the homeland further south toward Anatolia and the Near East, often connecting the spread of Indo-European languages with the spread of farming. Under this southern model, language expansion is tied less to conquest and more to demographic growth and cultural influence. Critics argued that the timeline was strained and that the model required too many assumptions about continuity from early Neolithic communities to later historical languages. As these debates intensified, the homeland question began to resemble a magnet. It attracted serious scholars, but it also drew in overconfident theorists. The pattern repeated again and again. A bold proposal is introduced. It becomes fashionable, it is challenged, then returns years later in revised form, almost like a ghost that refuses to leave the room. In the background, the same problem remains. If the homeland cannot be located with clear material traces, then every location is vulnerable to projection. The Caucasus and eastern Anatolia became especially charged territory in this conversation. Archaeological discoveries in these regions provided rich material cultures, and some observers were eager to connect those finds to Indo-European origins. Certain similarities were emphasized between distant archaeological traditions, sometimes with more confidence than the evidence warranted. Linguistic arguments were also recruited, especially when a language in the region appeared structurally unusual or difficult to classify. Yet other lines of research emphasize a different historical picture: the long presence of indigenous Caucasian groups, along with populations such as the Hurrians and the Hurrians, across broad zones that included parts of Anatolia, the Caucasus, and nearby regions. Under this view, the cultural networks linking these areas are real, but they do not automatically signal the arrival of Indo-European speakers. They may instead reflect regional developments and long-term interaction among local communities. Another recurring feature of homeland speculation is the tendency to treat valuable, impressive artifacts as markers of the right kind of people. When extraordinary burial goods or elite tombs are discovered, there is a temptation to assign them to whichever population a theory prefers. But material richness does not automatically map onto linguistic identity. A spectacular royal grave cannot be used as a shortcut to solve a language family mystery. This is especially important in regions like Anatolia, where multiple languages and cultural traditions overlapped across millennia. Trying to claim a prestigious set of finds for one imagined ancestral group can turn archaeology into a battlefield of symbolism rather than evidence. Debates over Hittite origins show how quickly this can spiral. Some narratives propose that Indo-European speaking groups entered Anatolia far earlier than the historical record suggests, living for long periods outside urban centres, then later rising into state power. Over time, according to this scenario, the language becomes filled with local elements, and political structures may even be shaped by non-Indo-European traditions. The argument then tries to explain how a language can survive while society changes around it. Such models can be inventive, but they often rely on layered assumptions that are difficult to test directly. Even burial customs such as cremation have been used as supporting evidence, with comparisons drawn across regions and centuries. But ritual practices can spread through contact, imitation, and prestige without requiring a mass migration of a language community. A custom appearing earlier in one region than another does not automatically prove that a people moved from the first to the second. Chronology matters, and so does the possibility of independent development or selective adoption. In the end, the homeland problem reveals more than a geographical puzzle. It exposes how strongly modern desires can shape interpretations of the distant past. The search for origins can become a search for ownership, prestige, and deep historical legitimacy. Different political climates encourage different maps. Nationalism, ideological conflict, and cultural rivalry can all push the homeland to convenient locations. In debates about ancient origins, the most dramatic claims rarely come from the ground itself. They often come from the desire to connect spectacular finds to famous names. Over time, certain ideological currents built a habit of assigning valuable artifacts and impressive early cultures to a single imagined ancestral group. Sometimes these assignments were made with conviction, sometimes with excitement, and sometimes with little more than ambition. And in the modern era, that habit did not remain limited to foreign scholarship. It also appeared in local discussions, where the temptation to place Anatolia at the centre of a grand origin story proved hard to resist. One recurring pattern is easy to recognise. A researcher excavates a site with important early Bronze Age metalwork, weapons, ornaments, or elite burials. The discoveries are genuinely significant, but significance becomes a ladder. First, the finds are presented as unusually central, then as a missing link, and finally as evidence for an entire migration theory. In this momentum, the site is no longer described simply as a settlement, with its own regional story. It becomes a stage for a much larger narrative about who belonged where and when. The discussion quickly moves from archaeology into identity claims, and artifacts begin to serve as trophies in an argument about deep ancestry. In one example, the interpretation shifts almost overnight. Earlier frameworks described Anatolia before the second millennium BCE as a complex landscape of local populations, with later arrivals and new languages appearing over time. Then, suddenly, the claim changes direction. The idea is introduced that Indo-European speakers were not newcomers at all, but had been present from the beginning, or at least since the earliest agricultural transformations. Under this version of events, farming is not only a technological change, but also a vehicle for language expansion. Anatolia becomes the launching point from which agriculture and language supposedly moved through the straits into Europe. A bold theory like this can sound elegant, especially when presented in popular writing, because it offers one clean solution to a messy historical problem. Yet even within the same popular discourse, the story can reverse again. The same material is later used to claim something else, that skeletal studies show a population is not part of the expected local type, and that it resembles groups linked to the northern Black Sea corridor or to the Caucasus. The implications are then stretched in different directions depending on the argument of the moment. What remains constant is not the conclusion, but the method, using fragmentary signals as a bridge to sweeping claims, and treating uncertain interpretations as if they were firm proof. Another strategy appears when material culture is pulled into a chain of similarity. If objects from one region look vaguely comparable to those from another, the resemblance is used as a shortcut to shared origin. Elite symbols, standards, sun discs, animal motifs, and ritual items are gathered into a single visual argument. The conclusion is then presented as straightforward. If one culture is assumed to belong to a certain language family, then anything that resembles it can be claimed for the same family. In practice, this is a very risky way to reason. Similar forms can emerge through trade, imitation, prestige exchange, or independent development. Visual resemblance alone cannot carry the weight of a major linguistic or ethnic conclusion. Sometimes the logic goes even further and becomes self-contradictory. A set of objects is labelled as evidence of a so-called primitive religious imagination because it uses animal symbolism. At the same time, those same objects are used to argue that the people associated with them must have been technologically advanced, even culturally superior, because the metalwork is extraordinary. The argument tries to hold two opposing pictures at once. A community is described as religiously simple, yet credited with producing some of the most sophisticated artifacts of its age. If the objects are truly the product of a crude worldview, then where are the comparable masterpieces of the supposedly more developed local population? If the technology and artistry represent the highest level possible for the period, then reducing their creators to a convenient stereotype becomes a narrative choice, not an evidence-based conclusion. The same urge to claim ownership appears in another form: the obsession with horses. Horse bones appear in various sites and layers, sometimes in contexts that are not fully understood. But even when the function is unclear, the remains are treated as a cultural signature and immediately assigned to a single group, as if the love of horses and the knowledge of riding or harnessing belong to one people alone. This idea is presented as if it were obvious, even though ancient life across wide regions involved animals, transport, and warfare in many different forms. The presence of horse remains is not a tribal flag planted in the soil. It is a clue, and like all clues, it must be handled carefully. These arguments often circle back to one central case: the Hittites. The temptation is understandable. The Hittite language shows archaic features, and Hittite culture includes elements that clearly interacted with older traditions in Anatolia and beyond. For some, this becomes a convenient explanation. The Hittites must have been an early branch that left a homeland sooner than others, arriving as a small ruling layer and becoming rapidly shaped by local influences. Under this picture, the newcomers are few, but powerful. They attract followers during movement, absorb diverse groups, and stamp a name onto a wider coalition. Ancient migrations, after all, were rarely neat caravans of identical people. They could involve leaders, warriors, opportunists, and displaced communities moving together, with the identity of the dominant core spreading outward onto everyone who joined the wave. At the same time, a crucial problem remains stubborn. There is no clear trail that proves a large-scale Hittite migration into Anatolia in the way popular imagination expects. There are no straightforward arrival layers, no unmistakable material package that appears suddenly across the region and can be labelled without doubt. Written records also do not provide an explicit migration story. The first glimpses are indirect: personal names, occasional words, traces in documents from the trading networks of the early 2nd millennium BCE. Then, later, the Hittites appear as a state power centered at a major capital, as if the spotlight turns on and the actors are already on stage. Because the evidence is thin, speculative interpretations can multiply. A single line in a prayer becomes a compass. A poetic description becomes a map. An image in a ritual text becomes a memory of travel. For instance, a religious hymn describing the sun rising from the sea is treated as a geographical hint. The reasoning is seductive. If the text says the sun rises from the sea, perhaps the people who wrote it once lived by a sea where sunrise is seen over water. From there, guesses follow. If the migration came from the west, perhaps that sea is the Black Sea. If it came from the east, perhaps it is the Caspian. The logic depends on taking a sacred image as a literal observational report, and it quietly ignores how easily religious language travels between cultures. Solar imagery, divine titles, and cosmic geography circulate across the ancient Near East. They can be inherited, borrowed, adapted, and reshaped without requiring a migration route behind every phrase. Linguistic arguments have also been used in a similarly flexible way. At one time, it was claimed that Hittite looks closer to western branches of Indo-European, so the migration must have entered Anatolia through the straits. But such claims were shaped by older assumptions about where the Indo-European homeland was believed to lie. When the homeland itself is moved around the map, the confidence of those older linguistic roots begins to fade. What remains is not certainty, but shifting probability, and that is very different from proof. Archaeology has supplied many objects that have been drafted into these debates. Pottery types spreading across large regions, burial forms that appear in multiple zones, hearth shapes interpreted as cultural signatures, burn layers, found in settlements toward the end of the early Bronze Age. The problem is not that these data are useless. The problem is that they are often forced into a single story. If a pottery style spreads, it might reflect movement, but it might also reflect trade, imitation, or shared technology. If a burial form appears, it may travel as a ritual fashion rather than a mass migration. If settlements show fire, it may result from accident, local conflict, or natural disaster. Yet in speculative narratives, each of these becomes one more arrow pointing to the same pre-selected conclusion. A simple test exposes the weakness of many claims. If these material features are truly markers of a migrating group that later becomes dominant, then why do so many of them vanish or fail to continue during the period when that group supposedly rules? If a tradition is treated as a cultural fingerprint, it should not disappear precisely in the age when the supposed bearers of that fingerprint are strongest. When such contradictions are ignored, the argument becomes less a reconstruction of the past and more a performance of persuasion. Another telling inconsistency appears around writing and administration. If Indo-European speaking groups were present in Anatolia early and needed writing, why would they ignore the most immediate and practical route? In the early 2nd millennium BCE, scribal culture and written administration were already present through trading colonies and international systems. Yet, the later adoption of writing traditions is tied to broader Near Eastern scribal conventions, rather than to a direct, early local continuity. Explaining this gap requires additional assumptions, and each added assumption makes the picture less stable. Meanwhile, the question of roots remains unresolved. Did the speakers of Hittite and closely related languages enter Anatolia from the west, through the straits, or from the northeast, through the Caucasus corridor, curving through zones where scribal practices could be acquired before reaching central Anatolia? Different models exist, and none closes the case decisively. In practice, the debate continues partly because the homeland game encourages dramatic placements. When scholars insist on anchoring the earliest Indo-European stage inside a region that already has rich archaeological cultures, the argument gains prestige by association. But the prestige belongs to the archaeological cultures themselves, not necessarily to the language label being attached to them. Behind these debates sits an even larger reality about the ancient world. Most ancient languages vanished. Entire civilizations wrote, built, prayed, traded, and ruled, and then disappeared, leaving broken traces that later ages struggled to interpret. Modern rediscovery unfolded slowly. Some peoples were first known through religious texts and foreign inscriptions long before their own archives were found. For a long time, names existed without clear substance. Then, excavations revealed cities, monuments, and inscriptions that changed the map of ancient history. The Hittites followed this pattern. Early mentions came from the perspective of others. References pointed toward the southern zones of Anatolia and northern Syria, where later states existed after the collapse of a major empire. This created confusion. The Hittites of later traditions were not necessarily identical to the earlier imperial power centered in central Anatolia. Only when major sites in the interior were identified and archives unearthed did it become clear that a powerful kingdom had once ruled from a heartland, far from the regions where later texts and traditions tended to place the name. This rediscovery process had its own drama. Travelers recorded monuments without understanding their script. Scholars guessed at identities, attributing reliefs to Egypt or linking unknown ruins to classical cities. Copies of inscriptions were made under difficult conditions. Artifacts were removed to museums, archives were shipped across borders, and early excavation priorities favoured written tablets over architecture and context. In time, thousands of documents emerged, many in languages already known to scholars of Mesopotamia. Others were readable as writing but opaque in meaning. Then came the breakthrough, the realization that the unknown language belonged to the Indo-European family. That conclusion was not based on a single clever guess, but on cumulative work, vocabulary parallels, and structural patterns that could be tested repeatedly. Even here, simplicity is dangerous. The ease of reading the script did not mean the past was easy to interpret. The language contained layers of borrowing, scribal conventions, and multilingual practices. The scribes who produced the archives worked across several tongues, and educational lists showed deliberate equivalences between words in different languages. Such material helped scholars unlock meanings, but it also reminds modern audiences that the ancient state itself lived inside a multilingual world. Language identity and political identity were not identical. This leads to another confusion that shaped public understanding for generations: names. The modern term, Hittite, has a history of its own. It entered European languages through older traditions and biblical transmission, then spread widely before scholars realized how messy the label could be. Different scripts and different languages were lumped together. Hieroglyphic inscriptions found in Syria were called Hittite, long before it became clear that the language behind many of them was not the same as the imperial archives of central Anatolia. Once a label becomes popular, correcting it is slow, and old terminology can survive even after specialists move on. The ancient people themselves used different self-descriptions. Their kingdom carried a name tied to the land and to a capital that had existed before them. They described themselves as the people of that land, not as a modern-style nation. Concepts like race, nation, or ethnic purity were not expressed in the way modern politics demands. Identity was often territorial, political, or dynastic, rather than biological. In that sense, calling them the people of the land fits the ancient pattern better than projecting later nationalist categories onto them. Underneath the naming is an older layer, the land's pre-existing languages and cultures. The earlier local language of central Anatolia was not related to the Hittite language family. It belongs to a different world, one that shaped place names, religious vocabulary, and cultural practices long before the imperial archives were written. The capital's name itself points back to that older layer. The later rulers adapted it to their own linguistic needs, making it easier to inflect and use in their administrative language. Over time, the capital name also became shorthand for the entire realm, the way a city name can come to stand for a state. This layered reality is the best antidote to the ideological tug-of-war. The ancient landscape of Anatolia was not a blank board waiting for one master people to arrive. It was a crowded historical terrain where cultures interacted, languages overlapped, and political power shifted. Trying to pin every prestigious artifact to one ancestry narrative reduces that complexity to propaganda, even when the people repeating it believe they are doing scholarship. The story of Hittite studies did not unfold in a vacuum. It rose during a period when an empire was collapsing, institutions were being reshaped, and intellectual attention was pulled toward urgent political and social questions. In that environment, there was little space for a sustained local tradition of ancient Near Eastern scholarship. Public life demanded immediate answers, and many prominent thinkers focused on modern identity, literature, reform, or the recent past rather than the deep, ancient layers of Anatolia. At the same time, archaeology in the late imperial period often followed European models, without fully developing the supporting culture of systematic publication and long-term research programs. Museums were established, excavations were conducted, and objects were collected, sometimes with genuine dedication. But the academic infrastructure needed to turn fieldwork into a stable scholarly discipline remained fragile. Even when excavations took place, reports were not always produced in a way that could anchor serious, cumulative research. The most lasting outcome of these early years was frequently the preservation of artifacts within local collections at a time when many discoveries across the region were being siphoned into foreign museums. As competition over antiquities intensified, the struggle moved beyond scholarship into policy. Foreign powers that had long benefited from extracting artifacts began to frame archaeological activity as something that required qualified oversight, as if those who had already emptied many sites were the natural guardians of the field. This kind of argument had less to do with protecting heritage and more to do with controlling access. It reflected a wider imperial mindset in which the ancient past of Anatolia and Mesopotamia was treated as a prize to be managed, collected, and interpreted elsewhere. This tension was not only about objects, it was also about legitimacy and belonging. For centuries, parts of Europe had looked at Anatolia through a religious and civilizational lens, often refusing to accept that the region's present could be shaped by those they labelled outsiders. In that worldview, the land's living societies were described as temporary, while the land's ancient cultures were imagined as spiritually owned by others. Even after military plans and political schemes failed to deliver the result some powers wanted, the language of occupation and departure survived in certain forms of popular historical writing. The past became another front in a long conflict over identity. In the early decades of the Republic, the challenge was therefore not only economic and administrative, it was also cultural. A new state needed a narrative that could explain continuity on its own soil, and it needed that narrative to withstand the pressure of foreign storytelling that framed Anatolia's deep history as something detached from the people living there. The question was not simply who the Hittites were, but why the Hittites were being claimed so aggressively in the first place, and by whom. That wider climate helps explain why early 20th century debates about the Hittites sometimes drifted into ideology. In parts of Europe, especially during the years when racial theories and authoritarian politics spread, ancient peoples were repeatedly recast as prototypes of modern nations. The Hittites, whose language had been identified as Indo-European, were pulled into these fantasies and sometimes portrayed as if they were ancient versions of modern Europeans. Heroic migrants, natural rulers, bearers of higher order, arriving to dominate local populations. In this imagination, ancient Anatolia became an early stage for a familiar colonial story. Outsiders arrive, take command, and remake the land. The evidence for such a story was often thin, but ideological climates do not require strong evidence. They require compelling images. Under those conditions, speculation could become reckless. Physical traits that are barely described in ancient sources were debated as if they were facts. Popular works sometimes painted rulers and warriors with modern racial symbolism, projecting blonde hair or blue eyes onto figures who left no reliable biological portrait behind. In the most extreme cases, even cultures clearly rooted in the Semitic-speaking world were pulled into the same racial map. The underlying habit was simple. Language affiliation was treated as a shortcut to biological identity, moral character, and even national temperament. Once that shortcut was accepted, fictional certainty spread quickly, especially in widely read popular books and historical novels. Some dramatizations went further, turning early Anatolian rulers into stock characters from modern Aryan epics. Small bands of fearless warriors conquering major cities in the dead of night, triumphing through discipline and destiny. This kind of writing may sound vivid, but it quietly teaches an audience to accept ideological assumptions as historical reality. It also flattens ancient social complexity into a single heroic script. Modern research approaches the subject more cautiously. It recognizes that language alone cannot carry the burden of ethnic purity, and it treats ancient populations as mixed, layered, and dynamic. Even within the Hittite state, names, rituals, legal customs, cult practices, and vocabulary show extensive borrowing and interaction. Multiple communities lived side by side, and their influence is visible both in written records and in material culture. The art that survives does not point toward a single uniform type, and depictions vary across contexts. Certain reliefs and processional scenes suggest recurring stylistic choices, compact bodies, angular faces, prominent noses, but these are artistic conventions, not a biological census. Ancient identity cannot be reduced to a modern racial portrait. In this complicated international atmosphere, new national historical frameworks emerged inside the Republic. They did not arise in a calm seminar room. They formed amid global propaganda, aggressive cultural appropriation, and intense pressure over heritage. The aim was to anchor identity firmly in Anatolia and to challenge the idea that the region's ancient past belonged spiritually to outsiders. In that setting, it is not surprising that some arguments stretched too far, sometimes even ignoring clear linguistic realities. Certain claims tried to pull the Hittites into a direct ancestral line that modern linguistics does not support. Yet the impulse behind those claims was often less about strict philology and more about cultural defense. A refusal to accept a system in which local land could be treated as someone else's museum. Institution building became the practical response. Historical research organizations were founded, and academic training was expanded. Students were supported to study languages, archaeology, and ancient history, with the expectation that a nation could not rely solely on foreign gatekeepers to access the records of its own geography. Universities developed programs that included a wide range of ancient and modern languages, along with Near Eastern and classical archaeology. The deeper goal was ambitious: to gather and analyze the texts that mention Anatolia across many archives and languages, and to build a comprehensive body of sources that could illuminate early history through direct engagement rather than borrowed summaries. This educational project faced a real obstacle: a shortage of local specialists who could immediately teach rare ancient languages and technical disciplines. In response, refugee scholars who had fled authoritarian regimes in Europe were recruited. They found stable working conditions, libraries were built for them, and classrooms filled with students eager to learn. Whatever the political tensions of the era, the academic result was lasting. Key fields in archaeology, philology, and ancient studies gained structure and continuity through institutional support and dedicated teaching. At the same time, there was sensitivity about who should teach national history. Some policymakers feared that professors trained within European traditions might carry inherited biases, especially in a period when European narratives about Anatolia were often openly hostile. This caution did not prevent collaboration in languages and technical disciplines, but it shaped how historical interpretation was handled. The approach tried to separate skill from authority. Learn the languages, master the methods, but do not outsource the nation's narrative to those who may not share the stakes. Alongside universities and research bodies, heritage policy became part of the state's identity project. Principles were set out for finding, preserving, restoring, and protecting artifacts, as well as for educating the public so that monuments and objects would be treated as shared inheritance rather than disposable ruins. The vision included regional centres where collections could be gathered and studied, local excavation programs that could grow over time, and cooperation with international experts without surrendering control of cultural assets. The point was not only to excavate, but to prevent loss through neglect and theft and unregulated export. In practice, the 1930s became a period of intense excitement around Anatolian antiquity. Major excavations produced objects that entered public life as symbols: emblems, logos, place names, institutional identities. Certain finds, especially sun discs and ceremonial standards, became visual shorthand for a deep past newly brought into the national imagination. Town districts, factories, banks, and products adopted ancient references in their branding, creating a cultural atmosphere in which antiquity felt close and present, rather than distant and foreign. This symbolic adoption was not the same as claiming literal ancestry in a biological sense. It was often closer to cultural integration, the idea that a modern society can acknowledge the many layers of its landscape without treating earlier civilizations as enemies or strangers. In that sense, the relationship to the ancient past became less about purity and more about possession in the civic meaning of the word, protecting, studying, and incorporating the region's long history into public memory. Even the terminology reflected this process. European languages used different spellings and sounds for the same ancient people, and those forms travelled into Turkish through the cultural channels of the period. Some older labels became popular for a time, then gradually faded as modern usage stabilised. Names changed, but the larger movement remained, turning ancient Anatolia from a foreign-controlled story into a locally studied field, with institutions capable of producing research, training specialists, and keeping material heritage within the public trust. Long before the arrival of the Hittites around the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, Anatolia was already one of the most deeply rooted cultural landscapes of the ancient world. Unlike many regions where human settlement developed in interrupted phases, Anatolia experienced the full sequence of prehistoric and early historic periods without major breaks. From the earliest Stone Age communities to the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and early Bronze Age societies, the region followed a continuous trajectory of social and technological development. By the 8th millennium BCE, well before many areas traditionally considered the cradles of civilization, Anatolia had already produced advanced settlement cultures. Sites such as Çatalhöyük near Konya, Çayönü close to Ergani, Göbekli Tepe near Urfa, and Aşıklıhöyük in central Anatolia demonstrate that complex urban life, ritual organization, and social planning emerged here at an exceptionally early date. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, Anatolia had reached a level of metallurgical expertise that rivaled even the highly developed societies of Mesopotamia. The extraction, processing, and use of metals, including early experimentation with iron, had become highly sophisticated. Although the personal names of the people responsible for these achievements remain unknown, later, written sources reveal that these communities were not erased by time. They were still present when Indo-European speaking groups later entered Anatolia, and they continued to live alongside them for centuries. These indigenous populations are identified as the Hurrians, a people who shaped nearly every civilization that followed them in Anatolia. The Hurrians belong to an ancient Mediterranean population group that shared a similar fate with many early societies across the Old World and beyond. Comparable patterns can be observed among the Minoans of Greece, the Etruscans of Italy, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, the early urban cultures of the Indus Valley, the Elamites of Iran, and even the native peoples of the Americas. Each of these societies developed complex cultures only to be gradually marginalized or erased following the arrival of later Indo-European or Semitic expansions. In Anatolia, however, the outcome was shaped by a unique regional condition. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, whose societies were built around rigid, centralized traditions and often resisted foreign influence, Anatolia was already remarkably pluralistic. From an early date, its communities displayed a cosmopolitan structure that encouraged coexistence rather than exclusion. Foreign newcomers were not automatically treated as enemies, nor was there a strong impulse to prevent them from settling within the land. This openness created an environment in which cultural interaction was not only possible, but productive. By the 19th century BCE, Assyrian merchants had established extensive commercial networks throughout Anatolia. Trading centres emerged, most notably at Kültepe near modern Kayseri, where local populations engaged in long-distance exchange with Mesopotamia. Textiles, processed goods, and tin flowed into Anatolia, while metal ores moved outward. These commercial relationships were based on cooperation rather than domination, and they introduced writing to Anatolia for the first time. Yet this early use of writing remained limited to foreign traders and local elites, and when the merchants eventually withdrew, the practice disappeared with them. It was into this rich and diverse landscape that the Hittites entered Anatolia. Their arrival coincided with a period of political fragmentation, rather than centralized power. Anatolia, at that time, consisted of numerous small city-states, often more than 20 in number, with no overarching authority capable of coordinated resistance. This geographical and political particularism allowed the Hittites to establish themselves first through gradual infiltration and later through military expansion. Their success was not the result of overwhelming numbers, but of strategic positioning within a society already accustomed to diversity. The Hittites arrived in relatively small groups and remained a ruling elite rather than a mass population. Anatolia's demographic balance, estimated at no more than 1.5 million people at the time, could not have absorbed a large-scale migration without collapse. Instead, a limited number of highly motivated, militarized newcomers were able to assert control over established populations. Similar patterns would later be seen in other historical contexts, where small warrior groups dominated far larger settled societies. Writing entered Hittite society not as an indigenous invention, but as a borrowed administrative tool. The earliest writing system, developed in Mesopotamia for record-keeping and state administration, was adapted by the Hittites only after their political structure matured. Writing was not introduced for storytelling or literary ambition, but for governance, inventory control, and ritual documentation. When the first Hittite rulers encountered the bureaucratic systems of northern Mesopotamia, they recognized writing as a powerful instrument of authority and imported it along with scribes, artisans, and administrative practices. As a result, the earliest Hittite texts were written not in Hittite, but in the international administrative languages of the time. Over time, bilingual scribes emerged, and Hittite was gradually adapted to cuneiform. Along with writing came a flood of cultural influences that reshaped Hittite society. Mesopotamian religious concepts, artistic conventions, and legal traditions flowed into the Hittite capital, transforming it into one of the most multilingual and multicultural centers of the ancient world. At its height, the Hittite capital was a city where numerous languages were spoken and written side by side. Hittite existed alongside Luwian, Palaic, Hattian, Hurrian, Sumerian, and Akkadian. Some languages were preserved only in ritual texts, others in administrative documents, and many were never written down at all. This linguistic complexity reflected the reality of an empire built not on ethnic uniformity, but on political integration. Although Hittite belonged to the Indo-European language family, its vocabulary was heavily influenced by the surrounding cultures. Borrowings from Hattian, Hurrian, Akkadian, and Sumerian were so extensive that the language became deeply hybridized. Its grammatical structure remained Indo-European, but its lexicon reflected centuries of coexistence. The result was a functional administrative and ritual language rather than a refined literary medium. Compared to the highly developed literary traditions of Mesopotamia, Hittite writing remained practical, direct, and largely utilitarian. The political history of the Hittite state was shaped by constant internal struggle. Early rulers faced revolts, succession crises, and rival factions within their own families. Military campaigns were often followed by periods of instability, as conquered territories slipped from control once armies withdrew. Power was maintained not through permanent occupation, but through repeated expeditions, alliances, and the redistribution of land to loyal followers. Over time, reforms were introduced to stabilize the state. Legal codes were formalized, succession rules clarified, and administrative districts established. Grain storage systems were constructed to protect against famine, and treaties were developed as tools of diplomacy rather than conquest. These innovations reflected a shift from a predatory expansion model toward a more sustainable imperial structure. Despite these efforts, internal conflict never fully disappeared. Assassinations, palace intrigues, and dynastic rivalries continued to undermine stability. External pressures mounted as neighbouring powers grew stronger and long-standing enemies exploited moments of weakness. Epidemics further weakened the population, disrupting economic production and military capacity. In its final phase, the Hittite state faced collapse not from a single external invasion, but from a combination of internal rebellion, economic strain, and political fragmentation. Local populations, burdened by taxation and military demands, rose against the ruling elite. When the capital was finally abandoned, the Hittite ruling class vanished almost completely from central Anatolia. Their disappearance underscores the reality that they had always been a thin administrative layer rather than a dominant population. The Hurrians were one of the most influential, yet least fully understood peoples of the ancient Near East. Their name appears repeatedly across the written traditions of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet their own voice remains fragmented and indirect. What is known about them survives largely through the records of neighbouring cultures, preserved unevenly and often distorted by the perspectives of allies, rivals, or later scribes. As a result, the Hurrians occupy a position similar to that once held by the Hittites, before their archives were uncovered and their language understood. Visible everywhere in traces, but rarely seen as a coherent civilization. The scattered nature of the evidence has shaped how the Hurrians are perceived. Their identity emerges through borrowed lenses, foreign chronicles, diplomatic letters, ritual texts, and mythological adaptations. Even later, religious traditions preserved faint echoes of earlier Near Eastern memories, filtering them through new theological frameworks. In this process, ancient peoples were not faithfully recorded, but reshaped, renamed, and sometimes misunderstood. The Hurrians were drawn into this long chain of transmission, leaving behind only partial reflections of their original historical reality. Linguistic discovery played a crucial role in bringing the Hurrians into clearer focus. The breakthrough came not through monumental inscriptions or royal annals, but through diplomatic correspondence preserved far from their homeland. One long letter sent by a Hurrian ruler to a foreign king became the single most important key to understanding their language. Written not in the international administrative tongue of the time, but in Hurrian itself. The document revealed a complex grammatical system and a linguistic identity previously hidden behind foreign scripts and conventions. Later discoveries of bilingual texts and lexical lists confirmed that this language was neither Indo-European nor Semitic, but part of a separate family rooted in the mountainous regions to the north. Current evidence suggests that the Hurrians originated in the highlands between eastern Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the regions surrounding Lake Van. Long before they appear in historical records as political actors, they lived alongside closely related populations in this rugged landscape. From there, beginning in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, they gradually moved southward into the river valleys and urban networks of northern Mesopotamia and Syria. This movement was not a sudden invasion, but a slow and uneven expansion shaped by trade, seasonal migration, and shifting political opportunities. Attempts to link specific archaeological materials directly to Hurrian migrations remain controversial. Certain ceramic traditions, architectural forms, and hearth types have been proposed as markers of Hurrian movement, yet these interpretations remain uncertain. Similar material patterns can spread through imitation, exchange, or fashion without involving large-scale population shifts. The presence of distinctive pottery or building styles does not automatically signal the arrival of a new people. The ancient world was interconnected, and cultural techniques travelled easily across political boundaries. What is clearer is that Hurrian communities were present across a wide area long before the rise of major imperial powers in Anatolia. Their names appear in early administrative texts, personal seals, and local rulerships scattered throughout northern Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia. These references suggest a network of small Hurrian polities, rather than a single centralized state. Some of these centers later grew into more substantial political entities, while others remained local powers embedded within larger imperial systems. One such centre emerged in the northern Mesopotamian plains, where a Hurrian-speaking kingdom formed around a sacred city that held both political and religious importance. Its rulers left behind inscriptions and dedications that reveal an established tradition of temple building, royal titulature, and divine patronage. The use of foreign administrative languages alongside Hurrian names indicates a society that adopted external tools without abandoning its own cultural identity. Economic records show that Hurrian speakers formed a significant portion of the population, even when official documentation followed international conventions. The collapse of earlier empires opened new space for Hurrian political consolidation. In the centuries that followed, Hurrian influence expanded dramatically across Syria and Upper Mesopotamia. Their presence became increasingly visible in major urban centres, trade hubs, and frontier zones. Over time, this expansion culminated in the formation of a larger political entity known to neighbouring powers under various regional names. This state did not arise suddenly, and its early history remains obscured by gaps in the record. But by the mid-second millennium, it had become a major force in Near Eastern diplomacy. This Hurrian-led state controlled strategic corridors linking Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Its rulers engaged in marriage alliances, diplomatic exchanges, and military confrontations with the great powers of the age. Royal correspondence reveals a world in which prestige was measured not only by territory, but by access to luxury goods, ritual expertise, and symbolic capital. Requests for precious metals, divine statues, and ceremonial gifts appear alongside declarations of friendship and appeals for support. Internal instability, however, was a recurring feature of this political system. Succession disputes, rival claimants, and external manipulation weakened royal authority. Neighbouring states exploited these divisions, backing alternative rulers and intervening militarily when opportunities arose. Despite periods of recovery, the balance of power gradually shifted. Stronger empires to the west and east encroached on Hurrian-controlled lands, dismantling their political structures piece by piece. As territorial control diminished, Hurrian political identity faded from the historical record. Yet their cultural influence did not disappear. Instead, it survived through transmission. Hurrian traditions continued within successor states, especially among closely related populations in the Armenian highlands. Their language eventually fell silent, replaced by others, but elements of Hurrian religion, myth, ritual, and social practice persisted long after their political structures collapsed. Hurrian culture was remarkably rich and diverse. Their artistic productions spanned metalwork, seal carving, ivory craftsmanship, and specialized technical knowledge. They played a key role in the development and dissemination of glass production and advanced metallurgical techniques. Their expertise in animal husbandry, particularly horse training, was widely recognized and adopted by neighboring societies. Manuals describing feeding regimes, training cycles, and conditioning methods survive in later archives, copied and preserved because of their practical value. Social organization among the Hurrians appears to have differed significantly from that of many contemporaries. Women held visible authority within royal and economic contexts. Queens owned property, controlled storage facilities, and exercised influence over administration and ritual life. Legal practices suggest that even lower status individuals enjoyed protections uncommon elsewhere, and some of these principles later entered the legal traditions of surrounding states. In religious life, Hurrian influence was especially profound. Their deities, myths, and ritual systems reshaped the spiritual landscape of Anatolia. Gods originally associated with local weather, fertility, and the underworld were reinterpreted through Hurrian theology and integrated into new pantheons. Sacred spaces carved into rock faces and open-air sanctuaries reflect a ritual worldview deeply rooted in the natural landscape. These religious forms did not replace earlier traditions entirely, but fused with them, creating shared cults that transcended ethnic boundaries. Hurrian mythological narratives were among the most sophisticated of the ancient world. Their stories explored divine conflict, power struggles, and cosmic order with irony, humour, and philosophical depth. Gods were portrayed not as distant absolutes, but as flawed beings driven by ambition, fear, and rivalry. Some myths mocked divine arrogance, while others reflected on the limits of authority and the consequences of hubris. These narratives later travelled westward, influencing traditions that would become foundational to classical mythology. Music, poetry, and oral performance played a central role in Hurrian cultural expression. Hymns and ritual songs followed structured rhythmic patterns and were performed alongside ceremonial acts. Although the exact melodies are lost, the surviving texts reveal a rich, symbolic language focused on fertility, renewal, and divine favour. Storytelling traditions included moral tales in which animals and objects stood in for human behaviour, conveying lessons about loyalty, gratitude, and restraint. Through these cultural channels, the Hurrians acted as mediators between older Mesopotamian traditions and emerging Anatolian states. They transmitted writing systems, ritual formulas, mythic cycles, and technical knowledge across linguistic and political boundaries. This catalytic role meant that their influence extended far beyond the lifespan of their political institutions. One of the most problematic and frequently abused aspects of historical writing is the unequal value assigned to past events depending on how closely they are perceived to connect with certain cultural spheres. Historical importance is often measured not by evidence, but by familiarity, prestige, and inherited admiration. As a result, some subjects receive extraordinary attention, despite lacking solid documentation, while others are marginalized or ignored altogether. This imbalance does not arise from data itself, but from selective interest. A striking example can be seen in the treatment of late Bronze Age Anatolia. Texts from this period contain no reference to biblical prophets, nor do they describe direct encounters between Anatolian polities and the heroic figures later celebrated in Greek tradition. Yet an enormous volume of studies, articles, and speculative reconstructions has been devoted to precisely these imagined connections. What is presented as scholarly enthusiasm often functions instead as cultural appropriation, shaped by expectations rather than sources. In many cases, the resulting narratives drift far from intellectual neutrality and operate within a world constructed more by literary admiration than by historical method. Ancient Greek epic poetry, with its elevated and emotionally charged style, has played a major role in this distortion. Over centuries, poetic imagination has repeatedly been mistaken for historical testimony. Satirical voices long ago pointed out the absurdity of treating epic storytelling as factual reporting. Yet, the habit persists. The tendency to read poetry as history has become so ingrained that monumental ruins are often viewed not as archaeological remains, but as physical stages onto which legendary scenes are projected. Walls are admired not for what they are, but for what audiences have been trained to imagine happening around them. Despite repeated reminders that epic tradition is not historical documentation, the search for legendary wars has continued with remarkable persistence. Written sources from Anatolia have been subjected to intense scrutiny, not to understand them on their own terms, but to extract confirmation for stories that originated elsewhere. Attention has been concentrated almost exclusively on selected names and passages, while broader historical contexts are sidelined. In parallel, a fabricated archaeological framework has emerged, designed to align material remains with poetic imagery. This approach resembles earlier attempts to construct religious archaeologies based on sacred texts, and it carries similar risks of circular reasoning and selective interpretation. Ordinary features of ancient settlements have been elevated into supposed proofs of epic narratives. Water sources, caves, pathways, and architectural fragments have been interpreted through literary metaphors rather than archaeological chronology. Elements that belong to much later periods are retroactively assigned to distant, legendary eras. Visual resemblance is mistaken for historical continuity, and coincidence is promoted to causation. In this way, speculative connections harden into assumed facts. Name similarity has been one of the most heavily exploited tools in this process. Linguistic resemblance alone, detached from chronology, geography, and textual context, has been used to equate unrelated places, peoples, and events. Through repetition, these equations acquire the illusion of certainty. Once they are widely circulated, questioning them becomes socially costly, even when the evidentiary foundation remains weak or non-existent. The result is a closed loop of interpretation. Hypotheses are treated as conclusions, and conclusions are used as premises for further argument. Conferences, exhibitions, and popular publications reinforce the cycle by presenting consensus where none exists. Over time, dissenting voices are no longer debated, but dismissed as outdated or obstructive. Critical distance is replaced by pressure to conform. This atmosphere has encouraged the transformation of scholarly uncertainty into public spectacle. Academic disagreement is reframed as resistance to progress, while speculative alignment with fashionable theories is rewarded with visibility. In such conditions, the absence of evidence is no longer treated as a limitation, but as an invitation to invention. Silence in the sources becomes a canvas rather than a warning. Material finds have played a central role in this transformation. Objects discovered in certain locations are granted inflated significance, solely because of where they were found. Items that are common across Anatolia and the Near East are rebranded as unique markers of legendary cultures once they appear in a celebrated site. Their broader distribution is ignored, and their ordinary function is replaced by symbolic value. The archaeological record is thus reshaped to fit expectation rather than interpreted on its own terms. Small artifacts have been burdened with extraordinary claims. Simple administrative tools are reimagined as evidence of literacy, identity, and political organization far beyond what they can support. The mere presence of an object is taken as proof of local production, local language, and local administration, even when identical items are known from distant regions. When counterexamples emerge, they are quietly set aside. This pattern extends to weapons, seals, figurines, and architectural elements. Each is recruited into an expanding narrative framework that seeks to assign them a role in imagined historical events. Alternative explanations are acknowledged only briefly, if at all. Over time, interpretation shifts from analysis to advocacy. The problem is not limited to objects, but also affects the reading of texts. Ancient documents are approached with predetermined expectations, and ambiguous passages are stretched to accommodate modern assumptions. Names are isolated from their contexts and linked across centuries and regions, without regard for linguistic development or historical plausibility. The complexity of ancient political relationships is simplified into familiar storylines of rivalry and conquest. At the same time, well-documented historical events recorded in Anatolian sources receive comparatively little attention. large-scale campaigns, population movements, diplomatic crises, internal conflicts, and social transformations documented in contemporary records are overshadowed by legendary wars, known only from poetry. The imbalance reveals a preference for familiar myths over unfamiliar realities. As a consequence, historical reconstruction increasingly resembles narrative engineering. Hypothetical empires are imagined on the basis of scattered artifacts and assumed trade routes. Pottery fragments are treated as markers of political control, while their limited quantities are overlooked. When similar materials appear elsewhere, they are explained away as imports, rather than evidence of broader interaction. Colonization is assumed in one direction and dismissed in another, not because of evidence, but because of expectation. The geographical implications of these assumptions are equally unstable. The same entities are relocated across vast regions depending on the needs of interpretation. Boundaries shift from coastlines to islands, from plains to mountain ranges, without any corresponding change in source material. What remains constant is not the data, but the desire to align it with a predetermined map. Over time, this process has moved far beyond academic debate. It has entered the realm of belief, prestige, and cultural performance. Challenging dominant narratives is no longer a matter of evidence, but of loyalty. Those who question speculative constructions are portrayed as obstacles, while those who adopt fashionable interpretations are celebrated as progressive, regardless of methodological rigor. The most troubling aspect of this development is the erosion of intellectual responsibility. Negative results, uncertainty, and unresolved questions are treated as failures, rather than as legitimate outcomes of research. The refusal to accept conjecture as fact is framed as stubbornness. In this environment, restraint becomes suspect, and caution is mistaken for conservatism. Yet, the fundamental situation remains unchanged. Despite decades of intense focus, no decisive proof has emerged to confirm the grand narratives that dominate popular imagination. The same limited evidence is recycled, reinterpreted, and amplified, while the core questions remain unanswered. The volume of publication has increased dramatically, but clarity has not. Historical inquiry, at its core, is meant to investigate what can be known, not to decorate uncertainty with confident language. When mythology is treated as documentation and coincidence as causation, the discipline loses its grounding. The creation of vast interconnected empires, on the basis of fragmentary remains and poetic tradition, does not expand understanding. It replaces it with illusion. In Anatolia, as in many other regions of the ancient world, history in its true sense begins only when writing becomes an integral part of organized human society. This development did not occur early. Writing reached Anatolia relatively late, nearly 14 centuries after its invention in southern Mesopotamia. When it finally appeared in the early second millennium before the Common Era, it did not arrive through local communities. It was introduced and used by foreign merchants, specifically Assyrian traders, who established commercial networks across central Anatolia. The written records from this early period are overwhelmingly commercial in nature. They record loans, contracts, shipments, and obligations, but they remain silent on many regions that would later become historically significant. One of these regions is Kizzuwatna. No contemporary commercial texts from this phase mention it directly. Instead, the earliest meaningful information comes from a legendary narrative preserved later in a Hittite translation discovered in the Hittite capital. This narrative, though mythic in form, offers invaluable clues about the historical geography and political realities of southern Anatolia during the early second millennium. For decades, the location of a place called Zalpa was incorrectly sought in northern Anatolia. This assumption rested on fragile reasoning, particularly the mistaken belief that the only river capable of carrying abandoned children to the sea must have been the Kızılırmak. As a result, Zalpa was repeatedly identified with a site near the Black Sea coast. When inconsistencies emerged, the theory was adjusted rather than abandoned, leading to the idea that there were two separate cities bearing the same name. This intellectual detour persisted for years, not because it was convincing, but because it had already gained momentum. Closer examination reveals that this interpretation cannot be sustained. There was only one Zalpa, and it did not lie in the Black Sea region. The geographical descriptions align far more closely with the river systems south of central Anatolia, particularly those connected to the Seyhan and Seyhan basins. One river in particular, the Zamanti, gathers waters from multiple drainage zones and ultimately feeds both the Mediterranean and distant inland systems through its tributaries. Its strength and reach make it entirely plausible as the river described in the legend. The abandonment of children along this river fits well with the landscape between present-day Tomarza and Develi. The motif of abandoning children in rivers does not originate in northern Anatolia. It belongs to a southern tradition, deeply rooted in Hurrian cultural narratives. Its appearance in this legend reflects that origin. Attempts to reinterpret the story as an early Indo-European myth, based on symbolic numerology or superficial comparisons with Western legends, represent a forced reading shaped more by ideology than by evidence. The mere fact that the story was later translated into an Indo-European language does not change its cultural roots. When the geographical and cultural evidence is considered together, Zalpa emerges as a polity located east of the Cilician Plain, with territorial reach extending toward the river deltas near the Mediterranean coast. Its political centre was likely situated near the modern Islahiye region, possibly at a large mound now partially submerged by modern dams. At the time described in the legend, the later Kingdom of Kizzuwatna had not yet fully formed. If it existed at all, its influence was limited, and Zalpa functioned as a distinct power within this landscape. Roughly a century and a half after the period reflected in this legend, a new political force arose in central Anatolia. The Hittites established a powerful military state, with its capital in a remote, defensible region. Despite their inland position, their ambitions were directed southward. Economic survival and cultural integration depended on access to the broader Mesopotamian world. Their campaigns and diplomatic efforts consistently focused on Syria and beyond, not on the Cilician Plain. Early Hittite kings crossed mountain ranges to reach northern Syria, sacking cities and transporting valuable cultural objects back to their capital. Notably, these campaigns bypassed Kizzuwatna entirely. The river mentioned in royal records from this era has often been equated with the Seyhan, but the topography does not support this identification. A western Syrian river fits the descriptions far more accurately. During these early campaigns, a city on the eastern edge of Kizzuwatna was besieged. The inhabitants, unwilling to surrender themselves or their property, destroyed their own city by fire. This act of collective self-destruction echoes similar episodes recorded centuries later elsewhere in Anatolia. Such events offer rare insights into the values and social structures of the region's populations. Diplomatic relations between the Hittites and Kizzuwatna developed slowly. Early treaties suggest a relationship based on parity rather than subjugation. Despite later assumptions, there is no convincing evidence that Kizzuwatna was incorporated into the Hittite realm during the early Hittite period. Claims to the contrary rely on speculative readings of isolated documents and overlook basic geographical realities. Even in much later historical periods, the mountain passes separating Cilicia from central Anatolia proved difficult to control, even for well-organized armies. As long as an independent power existed in the Cilician plain, large-scale military movement through the region was impractical. Central Anatolian forces could reach northern Syria more easily by eastern routes, bypassing Cilicia altogether. This reality shaped political strategies for centuries. Throughout the Middle Hittite period, Kizzuwatna remained a significant independent kingdom. Its rulers entered into treaties with Hittite kings on equal terms. These agreements covered issues such as extradition, border control, compensation for crimes, and mutual military assistance. The sophistication of these treaties suggests that the Hittites refined their diplomatic practices through sustained interaction with Kizzuwatna. At the same time, Kizzuwatna pursued a flexible foreign policy. Depending on shifting power balances, it aligned at times with Mitanni, at times with Egypt, and at times with Hatti. Its participation in international conflicts reflects this pragmatic approach. Yet foreign influence never translated into direct control. Egyptian artifacts found in the region arrived through trade rather than conquest. Eventually, the balance shifted. Later, Hittite kings succeeded in drawing Kizzuwatna into their sphere of control, first through treaties framed as alliances, then through direct political intervention. Members of the Hittite royal family were installed as priest rulers, respecting local religious traditions while ensuring loyalty to the Hittite throne. Even after political independence ended, Kizzuwatna retained immense cultural importance. It became a spiritual center within the Hittite world. Kings traveled there to participate in festivals, seek healing, and consult ritual specialists. Religious texts, myths, medical practices, and ritual knowledge flowed northward from Kizzuwatna into the Hittite heartland. This influence is visible in the archives of the Hittite capital, filled with translated rituals and narratives originating in the south. Specialists from Kizzuwatna served as healers, diviners, and ritual experts throughout the empire. Entire districts within the capital may have been dedicated to the performance of southern rites. Kizzuwatna was not merely a conquered land, it was a cultural reservoir. Through religion, medicine, and ritual practice, it reshaped the inner life of the Hittite state. In many respects, it functioned as a sacred landscape, a place where political power sought legitimacy through ancient tradition. When one looks at the physical map of Anatolia and the Caucasus, the most striking feature is the dramatic contrast between regions. Eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus are separated from the Taurus Mountains, Western Anatolia, and the Western Black Sea zone by an extreme landscape of rugged mountains, deep valleys, and harsh natural barriers. In historical geography, such environments are described as highly fragmenting. In landscapes like this, the emergence of a shared culture, and especially a common language, is exceptionally difficult. Yet once a language or cultural system takes root in such an isolated setting, it becomes remarkably resilient. Protected by geography, it can survive for centuries, preserved almost like an artifact, sealed inside a natural museum. Another important observation concerns climate and terrain. Aside from the forests that once covered parts of eastern Anatolia but have largely vanished in modern times, eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus share very similar ecological conditions. Unlike the sharp barriers separating them from western regions, there are no equally dominant obstacles dividing these two zones from each other. For this reason, even in modern times, the Caucasus has been known as a museum of peoples and languages, a region where dozens of distinct languages coexist within a relatively confined area. This same geographical complexity, however, makes the reconstruction of early history, language, and ethnography extraordinarily difficult. The challenge is compounded by the absence of writing. With the exception of Georgian and Armenian, none of the region's languages possessed a written alphabet until the 20th century. As a result, historical memory was transmitted orally for millennia. The Caucasus also remained far removed from the world of cuneiform literacy, and it lay beyond the direct focus of classical authors. Even well-known ancient historians never visited the region. What survives, therefore, is fragmentary, indirect, and often distorted. Despite long periods under foreign domination, the Caucasus retained its cultural and linguistic diversity. Across the Iron Age and into medieval and early modern times, waves of external powers passed through the region. Yet none succeeded in fully erasing its internal complexity. The survival of so many distinct identities under such pressure remains one of the most remarkable phenomena in Eurasian history. When attention turns to the second and third millennia, before the Common Era, knowledge becomes extremely limited. Outside of comparative archaeology, little direct evidence survives. Nevertheless, modern interpretations have often attempted to impose external models onto the region, placing distant homelands and speculative migrations at its centre. Such approaches frequently rest on selective reasoning and predetermined conclusions, rather than on consistent archaeological or historical evidence. Written information from Anatolia itself offers only sparse insight into eastern Anatolia. Early Hittite texts mention the region rarely and often without geographic clarity. Archaeological research, until recently, confirmed that Hittite political control did not extend deep into eastern Anatolia. Even where Hittite influence is suspected, the ethnic composition of the population remains unknown. Material culture indicates that this zone belonged to a different cultural sphere, closely linked to steppe traditions, rather than to central Anatolia. The limited textual references that do exist suggest that Hittite leaders often misunderstood the region's climate and terrain. Military plans were sometimes drawn without awareness of harsh winters and impassable mountain routes. These miscalculations underline how unfamiliar eastern Anatolia remained, even to powerful neighbouring states. Archaeological finds from the region remain scarce and uneven. A small number of pottery assemblages, burial layers, and isolated artifacts point to connections with the broader trans-Caucasian world. Similar materials appear across a wide zone stretching from the southern Caucasus to eastern Anatolia and beyond. Whether these objects were locally produced or imported remains uncertain. Their presence alone cannot establish political or ethnic dominance. Attempts to link ancient regional names directly with later historical peoples have repeatedly proven speculative. Such identifications often rely more on ideological motivation than on evidence. Linguistic assumptions drawn from later periods do not align with the archaeological realities of the second millennium, before the Common Era. From a sociological perspective, treaty texts preserved in later translations offer rare glimpses into social norms and misunderstandings between different cultural systems. These narratives reveal how radically different social structures could be misinterpreted by outside observers. Behaviours viewed as transgressive in one society could simply reflect different gender roles or family structures in another. Such misunderstandings are common in early intercultural encounters, and should not be mistaken for evidence of moral or cultural hierarchy. When archaeology is considered alongside geography, a broader pattern emerges. From the late Neolithic through the Chalcolithic and into the early Bronze Age, eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus formed a continuous cultural zone. Settlement patterns, burial practices, domestic architecture, and material production reveal long-term continuity rather than disruption. This continuity extends across nearly 2 millennia, a duration of stability that is virtually unparalleled in ancient history. Cultural change, when it occurs, appears gradual and largely peaceful. Shifts are visible primarily in pottery styles and funerary customs, not in evidence of widespread destruction or population replacement. These changes align with internal development and sustained interaction, rather than invasion. Among the most distinctive material markers of this shared world is a refined ceramic tradition, characterized by dark, polished surfaces and sophisticated craftsmanship. This ceramic horizon spread across an immense area, from the Caucasus to the Levant. Its distribution cannot be explained by short-term migration or trade alone. Instead, it reflects a deeply rooted cultural network, maintained over generations. The same pattern appears in domestic features such as hearths, tools, and metal objects, as well as in symbolic forms connected to ritual life. These similarities point to close kinship ties and long-standing cultural intimacy between communities across eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus. The peoples responsible for this continuity are known only indirectly through later historical sources. Names preserved in ancient texts represent political entities encountered by literate states, not necessarily the full diversity of the population. What can be said with confidence is that these communities formed a stable cultural substrate long before the arrival of historically documented empires. Linguistic comparisons have often been drawn between ancient Anatolian languages and modern Caucasian languages. While structural similarities exist, especially in agglutinative patterns, the chronological gap between them is immense. Without written continuity, direct genetic relationships cannot be established. Apparent similarities may reflect shared typological features, rather than common origin. In the modern period, such comparisons have sometimes been pushed beyond reasonable limits, shaped by nationalism rather than method. Ancient cultures have been retrospectively claimed as ancestral property, despite the absence of demonstrable continuity. Archaeology, however, does not support such claims. Cultural similarity does not equate to ethnic identity, and ancient societies cannot be assigned to modern nations without distortion. Mythological motifs offer another window into long-term interaction. Shared narrative structures, symbolic triads, and divine imagery appear across Anatolia and the Caucasus. These motifs are embedded in landscape, ritual, and memory, rather than in texts. Their persistence reflects cultural exchange across centuries, rather than direct transmission from a single source. Sacred geography played a crucial role in shaping religious imagination. Mountains, rivers, and natural formations became focal points of belief, reinforcing symbolic systems that outlived political regimes. These landscapes anchored continuity even as rulers and borders changed. Ultimately, the archaeological record demonstrates that eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus were not passive corridors for invading peoples. They were dynamic regions with their own internal logic, sustained by geography and tradition. External powers interacted with this world, but they did not erase it. The temptation to identify ancient populations with modern ethnic groups remains strong, yet it leads away from historical understanding. The past cannot be reconstructed through projection. What archaeology and history reveal instead is a long-lived cultural ecosystem, resilient, interconnected, and deeply local. For a long time, Kurunta was able to enter and leave a sacred rock sanctuary, even though access to this place was in fact forbidden. This continued largely because the prohibition was not widely known. The written order that defined the restriction was stored inside the sacred structure itself, under the authority of an individual named Marasanta. As long as the tablet remained in his possession, its contents were unknown, and the violation went unnoticed. Once the existence of the prohibition became clear, the reaction was immediate. A message was sent to Kurunta through Marasanta, instructing him to stay away from the monument without exception. At the same time, doubts arose about the reliability of the tablet itself. The possibility emerged that the document held by Marasanta might not have been authentic. To remove any uncertainty, the matter was investigated further. Officials were dispatched to examine the archive hidden within the sanctuary. Their inspection confirmed that the prohibition was genuine and clearly recorded. From that moment onward, Kurunta was formally and definitively barred from approaching the site. The text then turns to territorial regulations. The border zones of Tahundasa are described as belonging to the land of Hulaya. These areas were so strictly protected that even goat herders were forbidden from entering. If livestock were driven toward the large rocky salt flats for mineral feeding, this did not revoke existing salt rights. The salt source itself belonged to the king of Tahundasa, who retained the right to extract salt whenever he wished. Several settlements were granted to Kurunta, together with their fields, meadows, pastures, and salt resources. These grants were later confirmed and upheld by the ruling authority. Certain salt flats were declared untouchable and could not be claimed by anyone else. In one city, a single offering to the storm god of lightning had been made, and ownership of that offering belonged exclusively to the king of Tahundasa. Permission granted at a later stage to establish an additional sacred offering was likewise recognized and validated. After land ownership and usage rights are clarified, the focus shifts to the upkeep of temples. Regulations follow concerning religious duties within Tahundasa. These include the performance of rituals, the observance of festivals, and the breeding of sacrificial animals. To sustain the cultic calendar, annual provisions of cattle and sheep were allocated, ensuring that ceremonies could be conducted without interruption. The agreement places Kurunta's relationship with the central authority on a level comparable to another semi-autonomous royal house elsewhere in the realm. Religious celebrations traditionally presided over by higher-ranking rulers were also permitted to be conducted by Kurunta. This arrangement acknowledged his position without placing him on equal footing with the supreme ruler. Succession rules within Tahundasa are then addressed. Here, the text reveals an unusual arrangement. Only a son born to Kurunta by a woman provided by the royal household could inherit the throne. At the time, however, such a marriage had not yet taken place. This created tension, not only because of succession concerns, but also because it introduced pressure regarding marriage alliances. Eventually, flexibility prevailed, and Kurunta was allowed to designate his own son as successor. Military obligations were also revised. The number of chariot warriors and infantry troops previously demanded from Hulaya was reduced. From that point forward, only a limited infantry contingent would accompany campaigns, and no chariots would be supplied. Even these troops were to be released immediately after a campaign ended, and were not permitted to remain as garrison forces. Certain territories and settlements associated with major cult centres, sacred monuments, and mountainous regions were exempted from the land grant system. These exemptions indicate that earlier administrations had extracted heavy obligations from these areas in support of large religious institutions. The revised terms removed these burdens, acknowledging that previous demands had been excessive and unsustainable. The agreement concludes with extensive lists of divine guarantors, followed by blessings and curses intended to secure compliance. Witnesses are named, storage locations for the tablets are specified, and the document is formally sealed. The question of where Tarhundasa was located remains unresolved. The available evidence is limited, and although the treaty text provides extraordinarily detailed descriptions of borders, the absence of fixed reference points makes precise localization difficult. The boundaries appear to rely on relative markers, rather than absolute coordinates. One striking feature is the implication that the territory reached water bodies in more than one location, which does not necessarily imply access to the sea, but could reflect the presence of multiple lakes. Attempts to identify these places solely through name similarity have led to highly speculative conclusions. Field experience across the region shows that such reconstructions often ignore the physical realities of the landscape. Large lake systems in the area once had far lower water levels, exposing numerous settlements that are now submerged or reduced to small islands. Another category of evidence comes from fixed monumental remains. Rock inscriptions and reliefs scattered across the region strongly suggest that these locations once lay within the territory of Tarhundasa. Other nearby sites, identified through similar inscriptions, clearly belonged to a different political sphere, indicating a complex patchwork of control. Archaeological exploration in the candidate regions has so far been insufficient. Some sites, once considered promising, have failed to yield the expected administrative records. This absence is significant, as the relocation of major archives would logically imply the presence of written material. Without such finds, any identification remains hypothetical. The treaty text itself stands out for its rich geographic language. It describes terrain in remarkable detail, referencing mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, caves, rock formations, wetlands, pastures, and salt flats. This diversity reflects one of the most geologically complex regions of Anatolia. Natural features clearly served as boundary markers, just as they did throughout the ancient world. However, matching these descriptions to modern geography has proven extremely difficult. Various attempts have been made to equate ancient names with present-day features, but these identifications are inconsistent and often contradictory. The same mountain or water source is sometimes equated with multiple ancient names, depending on the argument being advanced. Two geographic references are especially critical, yet remain unidentified. One is a riverland that shared a long border with Tarhundasa. The other is a neighbouring country positioned between several political entities. Proposed identifications for these places vary widely, and no consensus has emerged. The scale implied by the text suggests regions far larger than some of the rivers proposed by earlier scholars. Because these anchor points remain unknown, the outer boundaries of Tarhundasa cannot be defined with certainty. Some reconstructions extend its territory deep into coastal zones. Others confine it to inland regions. None of these models can be confirmed with existing evidence. The mention of Tarhundasa in external documents adds little clarity. References to merchants from the land confirm its participation in wider trade networks, but do not resolve its geographic position. Without knowing where the land lay, the location of its capital remains equally uncertain. Earlier assumptions placed the city at a well-known mound due to the presence of a royal relief nearby. Later, excavation demonstrated that this interpretation was incorrect, as the site belonged to a different region and period. Other proposed locations have followed, each supported by selective evidence, yet none has achieved broad acceptance. What remains clear is that Tarhundasa occupied a landscape of extraordinary environmental diversity. Volcanic plains, deserts, marshlands, closed basins, sinkholes, springs, canyons, caves, rocky ridges, hot springs and mountain chains all formed part of this terrain. Such features would have provided natural reference points for ancient boundary descriptions and explain the exceptional level of geographic detail preserved in the treaty. Until new archaeological discoveries emerge, the exact location of Tahundassa and its capital must remain uncertain. What survives is not a map, but a landscape remembered through text, shaped by law, ritual, and political negotiation, rather than by fixed coordinates.